Okay, so welcome back to our third and final video for week 1. So in this video, I'll talk about what this thing called American Studies is. So American Studies can perhaps be best understood by what it is not. So American Studies is not a discipline, meaning that it does not have specific methods that are associated with it. So historians traditionally go to archives, they analyze old documents. These are the methods of history. Anthropologists traditionally observe people in various settings. They take extensive notes about their observations. This is called ethnography, and this is the traditional method of the discipline of anthropology. So historians don't traditionally use ethnography, and anthropologists don't traditionally go to archives, right? They're different disciplines that have different methods. But in an American Studies program, like ours here at Rutgers Newark, you can use any methods you like from any discipline as long as it makes sense for what you are researching. So this is why American Studies is called an interdisciplinary field. So I can use my own work as an example. So when I applied to graduate school, I decided that I was very interested in looking at how white Jewish New Yorkers, such as myself, remember our ancestral past in cities that are now majority black and brown, and particularly in the public school systems as either students or teachers, right? Because you have this general trajectory, particularly in New York, right, of white Jews who lived in New York City, particularly the Lower East Side, Brownsville, and then ended up moving largely out to the suburbs, Long Island, and elsewhere. And so you have this historical relationship, right, to parts of the city that are no longer Jewish, but are often remembered kind of as historically Jewish. So I wanted to look at how this process of collective memory happens and how that shapes our perception of our own racial privilege. So I looked at history programs and anthropology programs and sociology programs and education programs, and everything I looked at just seemed a little too narrow and too limiting for what I wanted to do. And finally, I found this magical thing called American Studies, which I had never heard of before. And in an American Studies program, I can use historical methods to study the history, right, of Jewish New Yorkers, and go to archives and find out what happened in the past, right, when these Jews still lived in New York City. And then I can use anthropological methods to study how people talk about this history in the present. So I've gone to panel discussions and I can observe people and what questions are they asking and what are they talking about and what's the tone, right? And that's the sort of piece of the project, right, that if I was just in a history program, I might not really be able to do. I can also work with sociologists and lawyers and political scientists and education scholars, right? There's no rules, there's no limits, and no one has ever told me, you can't do that. There are plenty of other interdisciplinary fields, and usually they have studies in their name. So urban studies, Puerto Rican studies, Africana studies, Jewish studies, women and gender studies, on and on. So American Studies is very similar to these fields in that they're all interdisciplinary in this way I've just described. And many of the scholarship we'll be reading was written by folks with degrees in these other sort of studies fields. So there's a lot of overlap. The difference is simply that American Studies deals with this thing called America. So if you want to study Chinese music from mainland China, you wouldn't do that in an American Studies program. But if you want to study the influence of Chinese music on the United States, or you want to study how Chinese musicians in mainland China talk about America in their music, those could be great American Studies projects, right? So it just has to do with America somehow. Originally, back in like the 1920s, 30s, the field of American Studies was very committed to furthering this idea of American exceptionalism, meaning that scholars were looking to study what makes the United States so great and better than every other country on earth. Thankfully, the civil rights movement put an end to much of that arrogance. So American studies scholars since around the 1960s have started to look for much more nuanced stories about American society and culture in terms of what is great and not so great, and everything right in between. The field of American studies has also been transformed by the women's and queer liberation movements, particularly by incorporating Black and Third World feminist theory. We won't go super in depth into this. If you are interested, you should take an Intro to Women's and Gender Studies class. But we'll be exploring two aspects of feminist theory that have transformed American studies, so intersectionality and transnationalism. And we'll talk about these a lot more in Unit 2 and 3. But the basic idea is that, Black and Third World feminists in the 1970s, pretty much, right, started arguing that there are all these interconnections, right, between people, people's different identities, the different oppressions they face, and the ways in which they, right, move, right, across national boundaries and borders, and that feminist theory, right, needed to take all of this complexity into account. So intersectionality in particular, right, refers to the multiple forms, right, of oppression that people face simultaneously: race, class, gender, sexuality, etc. So for example, in my work, I can look at, right, these white Jewish New Yorkers and their experiences in the schools, right, back in the 1950s and 60s, compared to how those experiences are being remembered, now in the 21st century. But what about the gender of those teachers? Did it matter, right? Did Jewish men teachers, right, have a different experience or memory of what was going on than Jewish women teachers, right? So just to ask that question, right, is to engage in intersectional thinking. And these are the kinds of questions that unfortunately really weren't being asked by many people until a lot of Black feminist theorists started to say, hey, wait a second. Transnationalism is the idea that societies and cultures transcend national boundaries. So transnational feminists in the 1970s started arguing, right, that women in all different parts of the world, right, needed to organize together to analyze, right, how women are oppressed globally, right, and not just within, right, the boundaries of a single nation. And think about, for example, migrant domestic workers, right, women from all over the world that come to the United States to clean other people's houses and take care of other people's children, right? That story cannot be confined to the United States. The experiences of those women cannot be understood by looking just within the United States. And for a long time, American studies scholars focused only on the United States as if other countries didn't exist or impact it. But more recently, scholars have been looking at how people and goods and ideas travel across and beyond borders. And some scholars have even challenged the use of the term America to refer to the United States while sidelining the rest of North America and South America. So back to my work as an example, so thinking transnationally, right, I might ask, well, how does what's going on outside of the United States shape, right, the experience, right, of these Jewish New Yorkers in the schools, right, in the 60s and moving up to today? And to give a specific example, right, what I found is that, right, the Six-Day War, which took place in 1967, it was a war in which the nation of Israel achieved a great military victory over many of its surrounding Arab neighbors. And that military victory, right, in the Middle East had a tremendous effect on the experience of Jewish New Yorkers here in the United States and their politics, particularly vis-a-vis Black activists who in many cases saw themselves as in solidarity with the Palestinian cause. And so there was this rift, right, that was, aggravated, perhaps one could say, by, right, these international events. So that's an example, right, of thinking transnationally about your research. So the field of American Studies today is very different than when it first came about in the 1920s. So today, American Studies scholars use a variety of disciplinary methods to ask questions about the United States and America more broadly that often incorporate an intersectional approach to identity as well as a transnational approach to national borders. In general, I have found American Studies to be an amazing and super fun field to be in because you can ask any question you want and you can study it however you want, as long as you take seriously the complexities of political and economic power in the United States and in a global context. So as we're reading the material over the course of the semester, I want you to think about your own interests and how you might study them using these approaches. So what about a study of queer karaoke bars in Tokyo and New York City? Or the impact of the South African anti-apartheid movement on activism in the Navajo Nation? Or comparing women CEOs in the US and the European Union? So, regardless of your own interest as far as academia is considered, right? You may or may not be interested in going into research, going into the humanities, but no matter what you're interested in, right, there's some way in which, and either your personal, professional interests, your own background, right, all of these things can be fodder for these really compelling projects and questions, right, that American Studies scholars ask. So as we're going through, right, the semester, just be thinking, right, about how your own interests could potentially be studied in these ways. And then in the final reflection at the end of the semester, I will probably ask you, right, to come up with some of these sort of hypothetical American Studies projects. So next, I want you to read Shelley Fisher Fishkin's article about American Studies in the 21st century. She covers much of what I've just explained in more detail, but she also does a really great job of highlighting the work of several intellectuals, particularly women of color feminists, Gloria Anzaldúa and Anna Julia Cooper, as well as W.E.B. Du Bois and Mark Twain, who you've probably heard of. And she just shows how these various thinkers, right, have really contributed to the ways in which American Studies scholars think. So even though those people wouldn't have necessarily said, I'm an American Studies scholar, right, their thinking, right, has been really transformative and impactful. And if you're looking for people to inspire you in this moment, right, which I often am, any of these figures would be a great choice. So I hope you enjoy that reading, and I will see you next week.